Thanks, Antoine, for the introduction. So like Antoine said, my name is Dan Na, and I'm an engineering manager at Squarespace. You can reach me at DXNA on Twitter. I'm here today to talk about feedback and why actionable and equitable feedback is an incredible means of growth for managers of high output and high culture engineering teams. My goal today is to cover three main topics. The first is why developing a strategy around delivering feedback is important. The second is explaining a framework I think about and use when delivering feedback, which is Lara Hogan's feedback equation. And I'll end with two closing takeaways. So first, let's discuss why this is an important topic to think about in the first place. Giving people feedback is such a fundamental idea within management that I think it's surprisingly easy to overlook it as a skill. But that's exactly what I'm going to argue today. Delivering feedback is a skill, and it can be done well or it can be done poorly. But luckily, with some thought, it's a skill that all of us can improve in. It just requires us to think about feedback strategically. First, I want to talk about this guy in the red suspenders, who is one of the most famous engineering managers ever, Bill Lumbergh, vice president of the software company Initech in the American movie Office Space. If you've never seen the movie Office Space, it is a satirical comedy that follows the lives of three software engineers working at a mid to late 90s American software company. The movie's hilarious, it has a massive cult following, and it's just an amazing commentary on the worst parts about working in an office environment. You could honestly probably write a management book on the topic of Office Space. Anyway, the reason I bring up Office Space is because Bill Lumbergh represents a popular view of management. And the role of Lumbergh in the movie is to stop by cubicles, repeatedly ask about the status of useless paperwork, and phrase a bunch of demands in a non-confrontational, condescending manner that makes it sound like he's asking for a favor when he's not. Office Space is satire rooted in reality. And I think one of the reasons why Office Space is so popular is because unfortunately there is truth to Lumbergh. Lumbergh is a realistic caricature of management failure. His actions as a manager are marked by a passive-aggressive, not micromanaging, drive-by style of intervention where reports see a visit or feedback from Lumbergh as something to dread rather than something to look forward to. And I don't think this is a very strategic implementation of management. So what am I talking about when I say strategic? The word strategic to me means that you are making conscious decisions that are directed towards a positive outcome. If I had to encapsulate the strategic function of engineering management, I think our job is to drive teams toward two North Star goals. The first, our teams are shipping the right software and they're doing it well. And well in this context means at the right pace, with the right level of rigor, demonstrating the right level of resilience. And this is important because we are employed to ship software. The continued employment of our teams is contingent upon us demonstrating business value. And the second goal, our teams operate under psychological safety, which means our teams trust each other. Our people are growing, they are invested in the success of the company, and we work in an environment marked by collaboration and honesty rather than politics and infighting. These goals are coupled because either in isolation isn't the full job. So for example, a team can ship without psychological safety if it's run by fear, which in the long run is likely to hurt retention and output. And a team that is psychologically safe but never ships anything is also bad because the ICs on that team are unlikely to grow and their continued employment is not justifiable to the business. And I think how you craft and deliver feedback is in direct pursuit of both of these goals. Because while it is obvious that it is your responsibility to deliver feedback to course correct a project or a bad technical decision, the manner in which you deliver that feedback will normalize into the culture within which your teammates treat each other. So feedback is critical because it is a lever for both execution and culture. Okay, so now that we're convinced that our strategy around delivering feedback is important, how do we go about delivering it? And so to answer that question, I'm going to deep dive into a reference that I've personally revisited time and again, which is Lara Hogan's feedback equation. Before we dive into the equation itself, let's define the two categories of feedback, which are redirecting and reinforcing feedback. Redirecting feedback is feedback around a behavior or outcome you'd like to see less of, and reinforcing feedback is feedback around a behavior or outcome you'd like to see more of. The feedback equation works for both types of feedback and is rooted in the belief that good feedback is specific, actionable, and helps the other person grow. And the equation is comprised of three components: the observation, the impact, and the question or request. So before I get into the specifics of each step, let's make it a little bit more real. Let's define a made-up example of a situation where you'd want to deliver redirecting feedback to someone on your team. Mary is the senior-most engineer on your team. She is friendly, she's very high output, and she has a strong technical reputation, But in her enthusiasm, she often dominates conversations in meetings and interrupts others who can't seem to keep up with her pace. You've just left an architecture scoping meeting where she dominated the conversation and regularly interrupted James, a more junior teammate. As the manager of the team, you recognize this isn't okay and you want to address this with Mary. So let's start with the first component of good feedback, which is the observation. And this is an objective, irrefutable statement about what had happened. So one way that Lara words this that I think is really effective is, if you had a video camera, what would have been recorded? Here are some statements that are not observations. You were really rude in the meeting, or it was obvious to everyone in the meeting that you think James is stupid. Not only are you likely going to put Mary immediately on the defensive, these aren't objective statements. Your definition of rude may not map to someone else's definition of rude, and you're not a mind reader. You don't know that Mary thinks James is stupid, and it's a dangerous game to put motives into other people's heads. So here's an actual observation. You interrupted James several times when you began to speak about the front-end build process. Anyone who was in the meeting can't refute the fact that this is indeed something that happened. It has nothing to do with emotions or motives, just facts. And this is exactly why the observation is so important. It enforces a baseline objectivity around your feedback. Let's move on to the next stage of feedback, which is the impact. And the impact is where your feedback lands. It's where you convey the importance of the behavior you identified in the observation. Mary interrupted James. So what? The impact stage also helps gut check what feedback is valuable and what isn't. And if you're considering delivering feedback on something and you can't think of a meaningful impact to communicate in this step, maybe you shouldn't deliver it at all. So here's an example of communicating impact to Mary. I spoke to James about it, and your interruption made him feel like his contribution isn't valued. Others on the team also take it as a signal that they should stay quiet during meetings. If teammates don't actively participate in these discussions, they don't learn how to architect systems, and that impacts their growth and slows our team velocity. It's also a good time to remind someone of external incentives. Mary, I know you're looking to be promoted to staff engineer. In our career ladder, a key cultural expectation of staff engineers is to actively level up their teammates by example, both technically and culturally. Not allowing more junior teammates like James to participate in team meetings is inconsistent with the staff engineer level. And finally, the last component of the feedback equation is the question or request. And this is where you close the loop with a definitive follow-up to ensure that your feedback is actionable. Whether you want to end in a question or a specific request is really up to you and depends on the circumstances. A question is great when you're trying to gather more perspective from the person you're providing feedback to. So for example, can you help me understand your approach in that meeting? Because if you dig in, maybe there's another reason to unpack. Maybe Mary feels time pressure for completing the project and wanted to get the meeting over with. Maybe Mary finds James really frustrating to work with. Maybe Mary is unhappy with her job and is simply lashing out. All of these are important for contextualizing her behavior in the meeting and your next steps as her manager. And I don't want to get into the topic of coaching too deeply, since I know Jill Wetzler just went into it in great detail in her own Lead Dev Together talk. But a question could also be a great coaching opportunity. You could end with an open-ended question that helps Mary drive to her own conclusions or invites more brainstorming together. So for example, what are some things you think you can do moving forward to ensure everyone feels safe speaking up in architecture meetings? And other times when a question isn't appropriate, you can end your redirecting feedback with a request. Would you mind letting James finish his thoughts in meetings before interjecting? I think it helped James feel more comfortable speaking up, learn more about architectural patterns, and encourage him to take more ownership of his work. As a small side note, sometimes when the feedback is reinforcing instead of redirecting, you don't necessarily have a question or request at the end, but the rest of the feedback equation still holds. So let's fast forward 3 months and there's another architecture meeting and Mary does an amazing job involving James in the discussion. You should absolutely acknowledge and celebrate her growth with some reinforcing feedback. Mary, I loved how you involved James in the architecture steering by soliciting his input on key deliverables. It's clear that James and everyone else on the team feel more comfortable participating in these meetings and are growing technically as a result. Thank you for your leadership. The opportunity to deliver feedback like this is one of my favorite parts of the job. So that is the feedback equation. And if you keep the equation in mind when delivering feedback, both large and small, it'll provide you guardrails to ensure that your feedback is objective, impactful, and actionable. And that's a good segue into what I will close with, which are 2 closing takeaways around delivering feedback. My first takeaway is to optimize feedback for reception and not delivery. This might seem like a counterintuitive thing to say because I just spent a bunch of time talking about the feedback equation, which is literally about the delivery of well-formed feedback. But what I mean by optimize feedback for reception and not delivery is that it doesn't matter how well-formed your feedback is if the recipient is not ready or prepared to hear it. And I think a critical responsibility of managers is to not only provide well-formed feedback, but to make sure that feedback has the best opportunity to be received. And I think what impacts reception most is context. My son is 2.5 years old now. This is a picture of him a week or so after his birth. After I returned to work following my parental leave, I totally underestimated the impact of my sleep deprivation on my ability to function at my typical emotional and mental levels. I learned over the course of the first 6 to 8 months of his life that I needed to prioritize my human-centered conversations earlier in the workday because that's when I was the most caffeinated. By the time the clock hit 4 p.m., I was too physically exhausted to be very receptive to feedback. So I asked for meetings with my manager to be at the start of the workday because I knew my energy levels early would make me more receptive to sensitive conversations. Being the parent of a newborn was my context. So context can be summarized as, what are the things that affect how someone may receive feedback right now? And there are a bunch of factors: career levels and goals, personality types, life events, the current socio-political climate, and even a pandemic. So based on conversations I've had with friends, I know for a fact that recent events around race have weighed very heavily on some of my colleagues from underrepresented groups. And I know that the pandemic and a lack of childcare and schooling have significantly impacted the mental and emotional bandwidth of many parents. Unfortunately, unlike the feedback equation, there are no easy rules around building this context with your reports, since it's specific to individual situations. Ideally, and this goes back to the manager North Stars at the beginning of the presentation, everything you do as a manager is building towards a psychologically safe work relationship where reports and managers feel empowered to openly disclose personal context when it's impacting their work. A few things that have worked well for me in building context is prioritizing weekly one-on-ones with my reports, proactively bringing up topics that I think may be impacting people. So for example, how are things going with the lockdown? And soliciting feedback on my feedback to know how my delivery or timing could have been better. My final takeaway is a reminder that delivering feedback is a privilege. I've heard from many peers that one reason they want to stay away from management is because the prospect of delivering feedback is uncomfortable. I've heard statements like, I don't want to have awkward and confrontational conversations around performance. I'm not going to lie, I don't relish those conversations either, but that is part of the job. And luckily, those types of conversations are the minority of feedback conversations I have. The majority of my feedback conversations involve delivering positive, reinforcing feedback. Like the example with Mary and her growth, it is the opportunity to recognize and encourage teammates who have stretched beyond their comfort zones to lead projects or deliver presentations or mentor or sponsor more junior coworkers. As managers, we are in a privileged position of authority and leadership on our teams. Feedback is the lever you have to nudge a team towards your beliefs on how teams should operate. It is the lever by which you reinforce the culture you believe in and shape the strategy and psychological safety of the engineering team that you aspire to be a part of. So I encourage you to approach feedback thoughtfully and strategically and use it as a means of building high output and high culture engineering teams. That's all I've got. Thank you very much. If you have any redirecting or reinforcing feedback for me, please reach out to me at DXNA on Twitter. Thank you.